Jens, let's talk about the U.S. context, because I find some of the data to be confusing. If you look at the unemployment rate, it's actually fallen quite a bit faster than sort of anyone had forecast a few months ago. On the other hand, you could look at claims numbers, as I just did, and it's a stall, or it looks like it is, as having flatlined the last 5 weeks. And at various points in this crisis, people have like, oh, the recovery is stalling, but it's not clear. Is even if we're not retrenching hard like we did earlier in the year in March and April, are we running into some sort of ceiling or risk of stall speed growth just because the absolute levels of the virus are still relatively high?
I think it's almost like you have a recovery that took place since, let's call it May, that had sort of two engines to it. The one engine was simply that you had reopening. Activity was allowed to take place in more and more places. Right. But the second engine was the fiscal stimulus. So I think in relation to the reopening, I think in the U.S., I think we can have a reasonable degree of confidence that looking a month or two out, probably the reopening will continue to progress. We had the restaurant opening announcement in New York was sort of a symbolic thing. Yeah. But the bigger question mark is around the second engine, around fiscal stimulus. That looks a lot more uncertain. And I think the question is, can this recovery, the pace of which is already in question, be sustained with just the one engine, the reopening, and not really the fiscal juice? That, I think, is the problem.
And that's a question that's being debated in Europe as well. We've seen Germany extend their fiscal support, particularly for the unemployed, out through to 2021. But then you see the UK and the Chancellor there really having to push back on extending their support and their ongoing furloughing of and support of the employee base past October. And what do you see, for example, for the UK at the moment? Are they taking the right path? I mean, particularly they seem to be making their own hole for themselves with Brexit too.
Well, I guess it's a question of whether we move into a domain where people don't care about levels of deficits at all, right? So we've already seen a seismic shift this year where people are willing to embrace deficits of a level that was really viewed as unthinkable before, right? So the UK is a place where they have very large fiscal deficits, but nevertheless, they're not willing to just go to any level of deficit, and therefore there's talk about tax hikes and so forth. And that's certainly feeding into the economy and perceptions about where the economy is heading. And it's feeding into interest rates as well. There's now pricing of negative interest rates in the UK that is a function of what's going on the fiscal side.
Long term on the fiscal question, you mentioned that there's been this view, deficits are now more tolerated than they have in the past. Do you think this is going to be a permanent feature of the post-crisis landscape, or is it, okay, maybe we'll get one more big stimulus, but nothing will, the end will just go back to macro management, kind of like what we used to see?
I think fundamentally speaking, we're in a world where interest rates are pretty much zero in all major economies, with China being the one exception, right? So the fact that monetary policy is pretty much out of juice means that we have to do fiscal policy to get any stimulus in the pipeline. So that's a shift that is not going to go away. Then there's another question about, okay, is the politics going to allow it? But that's sort of almost like a tactical consideration on top of the fact that fiscal is needed to generate stimulus. That's the only game in town at this point in time.
All right, Jens, great to have you. Great to get your insights there. That's Jens Nordvig. He's the founder and CEO of Exante Data.